you can't replace a healthy diet. 70 to 80% of what we see is diet related: obesity, type 2 diabetes, kidney problems. A lot of people are on kidney transplants, pretty much the majority of them because of diabetes.
Dom D'Agostino, professor at the University of South Florida with PhDs in both physiology and neuroscience, author of countless medical and academic publications. Dr. D'Agostino's lab at the University of South Florida develops and tests metabolic-based strategies for targeting seizures, epilepsy, neurodivergent diseases, and cancer.
If we want to prevent disease, we need to really focus on metabolic health as the cornerstone for disease prevention. If you do something like that and employ like a metabolic therapy where your brain is lit up, I think there's a lot of potential innovation in that space for therapies when they're coupled. The underlying cause, I think, is going to be really important to target too, and that could be helped by...
So Dom D'Agostino, one of my favorite people in all of the ketogenic space. I'm going to start by saying thank you for giving me another decade with my mom. You might not remember this, but I was an internal medicine physician running my own clinic, studying peak brain performance, and you and Tim Ferriss broke my world when I heard the two of you talking about how brains were improved. And I was copying a lot of things that you'd done. We were matching until you got to the word ketogenic diet. And I embarrassingly had no idea what you were talking about. That was in, I think, November of 2015, November of 2014 or 15, I can't remember. And your research rocked my world. A few months later, my mother got a relapse of her cancer, and I, thanks to you, had studied the ketogenic diet, seen that cancer impacts with ketones, not having perfect evidence for what she was going through. But thanks to your science, we helped her and she got her life back, and then another decade with me before she passed away from COVID. But so thanks for a decade with my mom.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I remember everything. I remember so many patients. Thousands have reached out to me, and so many stories. I was just thinking, wow, there's a lot of great case reports there with all the stories, and with a whole bunch of different maladies, from cancer to different brain disorders. And, you know, more recently, a patient that has a child with MADD, where the standard of care, the only thing that works really is the DL beta hydroxybutyrate salts. And there's remarkable effects, you know, from this. And there was a paper by Van Hove that we talked about in 2003 in Lancet, you know, that shows the remarkable therapeutic effects of ketones. And that was also one of the original papers. Dr. Richard Veach inspired me to go down this path. Dr. Brunengraber from Case Western, and Dr. Mary Newport too.
Right,
actually,
all of them. Yes, those stories are like the history of the people who said their stories shape the courage for all of us to say, let's just not close our eyes to what's ahead. So back up just a second. Describe what MADD is and what the kids usually eat and why they can't eat fat. So explain that just a little bit more, because I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, there are various fatty acid oxidation disorders. So there's multiple acyl-CoA deficiency syndrome, and it's very rare. And these kids that have it, or the adults that go on to live with it, they cannot eat fat because it's a fatty acid oxidation. So they have to have protein and a high carb diet, but they can consume ketones because ketones are not fat. They're like water soluble. And these ketones have been shown in multiple publications to increase the reverse cardiomyopathy and increase the ejection fraction of the heart, and actually symptomatically get patients up and moving. Actually, you know, the lights come on, like they literally wake up and start moving around. And these are like the reports from patients. And I've, you know, been in contact with the physicians that have the cases too, that work with the patients, and they validate the remarkable therapeutic effect of ketones. So it's just like, you know, and there's a number of different disorders, I think, that are highly responsive to the ketogenic diet. Of course, drug-resistant epilepsy, glucose transporter deficiency syndrome, inborn errors of metabolism. I always thought were kind of like the low-hanging fruit, but then they work by virtue of targeting a neurometabolic defect. And that would also apply to pretty much every neurodegenerative disease is pathophysiologically linked to energy dysregulation. And that could be impaired glucose metabolism, enzymatic metabolism, and ketones tend to bypass the multiple impairments associated with glucose metabolism as it pertains to Alzheimer's, for example. So there's the GLUT3 transporter and PDH complex, and these things are bypassed by ketone metabolism. So they can energize the brain, restore brain energy metabolism. So there's just so many different applications to therapeutic ketosis.
Well, so this is what I hoped we would talk about. That your superpower is that you have been around the space long enough to see, the history of how ketones were much like what I had. I had no training on this. I had ketoacidosis was the only word that was in my vocabulary before some of that learning curve. And then as that, there's almost been like a bimodal wave. There was this huge wave of a ketogenic diet, and then it kind of calmed down. And in recent years, at least from my perspective, the ketogenic diet has been much better received. And I think that the education level is just so much richer behind the diet, not nearly as much, glib answers like, oh, you're going to die of a heart attack. There's way more beyond that. But your superpower is that you know so much about ketones that I would love to hear if you had to list or think of it like the top 3 things that you were surprised to see that exogenous ketones made a difference. What's been surprising to you looking at that history?
Yeah, well, I have to kind of give a little bit of a backstory, like how I got into it, I guess. So originally, I got interested in ketone esters, and it was Dr. Richard Veach and the late Dr. George Cahill. I think he passed away in 2012, and I had conversations with them quite often on the phone. So these were like real icons, and Dr. Theodore Van Italy, if he's still alive, talked to him a few years ago. He was 95 at the time. He did research with the ketogenic diet. So, and he had done a study on Parkinson's disease, which I was kind of interested in. But my main focus in 2008, I think when we got a contract with Office of Navy Research, was mitigating seizures, oxygen toxicity seizures. So working with chemist Patrick Arnold, we were able to synthesize, working with different people to validate this molecule. I was mostly interested in ketone esters, and this was a 1,3-butanediol acetoacetate diester, and that had remarkable effects. Started those studies in 2010, and then had the idea of taking beta-hydroxybutyrate. At the time, the only beta-hydroxybutyrate salt was sodium beta-hydroxybutyrate. And in the CAS database, no one had even thought about potassium beta-hydroxybutyrate. So, and come to find out, you can't even buy it because no one had made it. And there was like a vague sort of, patent that described it in theory. But then in 2011, we sort of were able to conceive, synthesize, and test beta-hydroxybutyrate salts in 2011. And that would be sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. And I sent some to a year later in 2012 to Peter Attia, and he tested them and actually showed maintaining 180 watts on the bike that he could maintain that level and consume like less oxygen, like 8% less oxygen, kind of validating the metabolic efficiency of it. Right.
And if anybody would keep track of that before and after, it would be Peter Attia.
Yeah, I think that blog, if you look up that blog, it's like, exogenous ketones, Peter Attia, jet fuel or something like that.
I read it.
Written 2013 or 14. And then shortly after developing, a range of different ketone salts, racemic salts at the time, we combined beta-hydroxybutyrate salts with MCT. And then that became a very good combination because the MCT sort of stimulates your own body to make ketones. So it stimulates endogenous ketosis. And then that fat also delays gastric absorption in a way to extend and further elevate the ketones from the exogenous ketones. So that became sort of like, something that came out of our lab. And now we have, a dozen or more different molecules. We have diesters and triesters of, different molecules that we're testing. Some of it we have not published yet, but we have a whole library of different compounds that are very unique. Some of the publications are being reviewed now. And I'm excited about the future of this because I think it's a very nascent field. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for innovation. And I think there needs to be a lot of testing to validate certain formulations for certain disorders.
Well, let's go back to the Parkinson's, because I think that's a great place where the esters were around, the salts were around, and it's one of the most common brain disorders that has been in my clinic. And when you see patients say, I've got my 65, 80, 70-year-old, 80-year-old relative who's got Parkinson's, and you say, well, that ketogenic diet will help it. But their ability to do a ketogenic diet is like, it's laughable. They've got
possible.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when you've watched the different esters versus salts impact, we can just take Parkinson's, or you can take whatever brain disorder you're thinking of. How would you compare the difference between how an ester was impacting it versus the salts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure clinical trials have been done with the salts, but I know Dr. Nick Norwitz, who's a good friend of mine,
too,
and colleague, he actually, for his PhD dissertation, he studied the 1,3-butanediol beta-hydroxybutyrate monoester in patients with Alzheimer's and showed like an improvement in motor function, significant improvement. So that publication pops up if you look at it. And then anecdotally over the years, probably maybe 2 or at least 3 dozen patients, I think, with Parkinson's disease are further enhancing ketosis. Either, a lot of times they're not using a ketogenic diet because it's too hard to follow, but they're doing a low carb Mediterranean diet and they might add some MCT. So my recommendation is usually BHB salts with MCT with a low carb diet that's sort of in line with like a Mediterranean diet, something that's not too far off from kind of what they're already doing. And many of them see remarkable improvements. And especially, I think ketogenic therapies are also augmented when you couple it with like exercise, of course. Exercise is a huge lever, but I think the adaptive responses to exercise, especially from the level of the central nervous system and maybe at the muscle too. I'm a physiologist, but my kind of focus has always been the brain. But I think when you energize the brain and you provide a right energetic environment for the brain and also augment certain signaling pathways, and then you couple that with exercise, and it could be, or learning. So, or, there's a place downtown in Tampa where it's like Tango Flex, where they take Parkinson's disease patients and then they're learning like tango. So it's like social, physical interaction. So you're like learning, and then it's exercise, but then it's social interaction. And, and kind of like, if you do something like that and employ like a metabolic therapy where your brain is lit up while you're doing that, I think there's a lot of potential innovation in that space for therapies when they're coupled, where, 1 and 1 equals 3, more or less, where you get synergy.
Well, I think it brings it back to, as I entered the space and really took a deep dive into trying to find the best ways to, continue a internal medicine practice and not deny what you can't unsee. When these patients got so much better with a ketogenic state, it made your your Neurontin prescription seem like this little flicker in the wind, because it was so less likely to make that life altering change. So then I would get questions like, okay, so I want to use these ketones for my Parkinson's mom. How often should they drink them? How much should they drink? And that you're right, the studies on them are not giving me any of those answers. So I have a clinical answer, knowing what has worked.
I have an answer.
Okay.
I didn't, but I think a lot of people in the past, and I was one of them, would try to get my ketones as high as possible. Yeah. So I was doing that with the esters, with 1,3-butanediol and other things. And
like, hey, look at my number. Right.
Yeah. And that's not the best. I think you actually get into a situation where you get energy toxicity, where the ketones are so elevated in the blood and your body's, you have ketonuria, but then they create an acidosis. And we test blood gases, and one of the early signs we saw with a large dose of a ketone ester is that it acidified the blood to like 7.0.
Oh, wow. That's dangerous.
The animals recovered, but But unfortunately, when we have lost animals due to ketoacidosis with a large dose of an ester, it's because the blood pH becomes acidic. So, and some of the things that we test, for example, the therapeutic dose is not too far lower than the lethal dose. So for something like super like powerful tonic-clonic seizures and things like that. But we've learned that we can reduce side effects with esters and actually get a better response when we couple the ester with MCT. So it's similar to MCT and the ketone salts. So the MCTs have been really good in our hands, a therapeutic tool. But simply elevating ketones into that 1 to 2 millimolar state would not create any kind of metabolic acidosis for people who have normal respiration, kidney function, hydration, electrolytes, and things like that. So I think that would be sort of like my go-to. Like my email blows up every day with at least 100 emails from different patients. And I and I direct them to other sources. But when it comes to therapeutic ketosis outside of the diet with exogenous ketones, if you get into that 1 to 2, and depending on the situation, maybe 3 millimolar, but 1 to 2 millimolar above where you're at, that's therapeutic. That's actually lowering glucose. It's giving your brain alternative fuels. And even from the signaling perspective, from an epigenetic, from changing, neuropharmacology of the brain and some of the stuff that we look at in the lab in the Petri dish too, we're seeing signaling effects, at that level. So yeah, you don't need to get up to 2, 3, 4, 5 millimolar, and that could be detrimental.
Right. So, that's totally where we tell people to go. Is you're going to do a lot better if you teach them how to drink, have some ketones for the first few days of a ketogenic diet, and then the closer you can get to the place where your body's making those ketones, the better. But there are brain injuries, and my concussion patients are one of the places where they get a concussion. They've never heard of a ketogenic diet. We'll get you there, but between now and the time you're going to get it all figured out and be able to sustain living in this place where you don't have French fries and a soda pop every day. Let's just get your brain healthy. Let's get your brain with a different fuel access. And so your work and the amount of research around it has really trickled into real life patients and real life care. And my patients thank you. I thank you. I want to ask, when you look at other brain disorders, and I'll specifically ask about multiple sclerosis. I know several of the articles that Metabolic Health Summit has put out and has supported in their research really is one of the few places that I've been satisfied with how they're looking at MS. Can you just give a little insight to what the exposure to MS, ketones, and how that has changed over the decade where you've been watching ketones?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, MS is not something we directly study in the lab, but I've gotten quite a few people reach out to me, and I've talked with, for example, Terry Walls, medical doctor, who's kind of cured herself of MS and is a fan of, the Walls diet and the Walls protocol. I encourage people to look that up, but also a ketogenic diet. And we've had many conversations about a ketogenic diet being therapeutic for that application. And as she's not only a patient, but a research scientist, even medical doctor working in that field.
Her story is incredible too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. So, MS is kind of, the etiology of MS is kind of largely unknown, but it's correlated with, autoimmune activation and demyelination scenario. And, dietary therapies are probably one of the most important, biggest levers that we can pull.
And I'll tell you, specifically in that space, as an internist, where you leave medical school knowing that MS is haunting. It's this place where we don't have lots of answers. When we get somebody doing well, everybody kind of prays and holds their breath that the symptoms don't come back. But I'll tell you, one of my most surprising, swallow humble pie, that I said it this way before I learned ketosis is, and a ketogenic diet, was when autoimmune problems happen. Prior to this space, you never reversed them. They never went away. And I cannot believe the number of autoimmune disorders, from Crohn's disease to ulcerative colitis, that, they're still living their life. They have not had a relapse. They are in a space where the autoimmune disorder did the opposite of what I said. It went away when I said, you can't do that. It's not in my book. It doesn't happen that way. And I think that impact on how I'm very careful to say, you can't do that anymore because of their testimonies. MS has probably been the one where I've spent more energy saying, I know this is what the textbook says, but there's an autoimmune basis to this. And the number of MS patients out there, and I use Terry's story a lot, where they reverse that problem, it's remarkable. So do you find people that as they write into you about that and they want to use the supplements of a ketogenic diet, that they're ever able to get that level of persistent ketosis with just supplements to get an autoimmune disorder to reverse?
Yeah, well, I think it's helping acutely at the level of the bioenergetic level. So it's energizing neurons that are maybe defective. There might be a mitochondrial sort of issue there. The underlying cause, I think, is going to be really important to target too, and that could be helped by ketosis. So I'm of the opinion that various infectious diseases are kind of a trigger for many different disorders. Like you could talk about Lyme's disease, Borrelia, for example, but you have CMV, Epstein-Barr, you have HSV, you have like a whole host of different viruses that I think are impacting the immune system in a way that's triggering an autoimmune challenge, specifically directed towards, in some cases, demyelination. So, but one way, an elimination diet, we know, and I think a ketogenic diet can help to silence sort of that autoimmune trigger, and I think can enhance the healthy immune response of the individual. For example, like I've been working with Moffitt on different collaborative projects. There was a study with a vegan diet and a ketogenic diet for 2 weeks, and the vegan diet enhanced the innate immune system, and the ketogenic diet greatly augmented the adaptive immune response. And that's significant in the context of cancer because that could further enhance like checkpoint inhibitors, like the PD-1 inhibitors and things like that. So like a lot of people are steering in that direction and using ketogenic diets to enhance other forms of immune-based therapies. So I know with MS, there are immune-based therapies for MS, and I have a hunch that, a ketogenic diet therapy could enhance and augment the existing therapies for MS that maybe are not working, that don't have the best track record. But I think there's a lot of potential there by, helping your mitochondria. Like Dr. Walls talked about, her TEDx talk was Mind Your Mitochondria, I think, and sort of it's all about mitochondrial health. Yeah. So ketones do that, and they have enhanced energetic efficiency. They help to replenish NAD. Everybody's talking about NAD supplements, but the late Dr. Richard Veach used to shake his head at all supplements and was like, "It's the ketone, stupid." Like he used to say that to me all the time.
I actually read some of his stuff and have quoted him on saying, I have that same frustration where back it up and do a ketogenic diet, you're going to have so much better delivery of that ketone and the energy and the side effects and your pocketbook.
Mm-hmm. And you could throw, I was very interested in antioxidants for what I was studying early on. And they tend to work like in a petri dish, sometimes in animal models, but in humans, like they don't work. So the root of the majority of oxidative stress and free radicals is the mitochondria. So that starts with superoxide and the electron transport chain. And when you're metabolizing ketones for energy, it increases energetic flow in a way that decreases superoxide production out of the mitochondria. And that superoxide can go to more reactive intermediates like hydroxyl radical and then be more reactive. So the ketosis, and that could be intermittent fasting, could be ketogenic diet, it could be exogenous ketones, really treat the root cause of many different maladies that are associated with mitochondrial dysfunction and the resulting oxidative stress, which then contributes to inflammation. So a lot of the inflammatory effects of different disease processes are associated with excess oxidative stress, and that's a trigger for certain cytokines and chemokines that have, promote inflammation. And even like with COVID-19, I think if you look at like ketones and COVID-19, there's a couple of really good reviews out there. But it helps to mitigate through the NLRP3 inflammasome, IL-1 beta, and other pathways to suppress the cytokine storm that's associated with that. So now there's on clinicaltrials.gov, there's, they're using metabolic therapies like ketogenic diets or exogenous ketones for COVID-19 even.
Well, it's great that you said that. Right. When you say this, I can't wait for my team to watch this video, because many times we have this struggle of as we look at how do you educate the public today on something like a ketogenic diet, like medical problems that could be influenced by that. And when I would get into the nuances of, having these beautiful slides that talk about all of the different parts of a cytokine storm and how they're affected by a ketogenic state, and then try to show that to the public, my team would be like, no one cares. I'm like, yes, they do. Yes, they do. So you just validated my whole purpose. I am now going to win this argument.
It starts with education.
Yeah.
And our medical school actually has a mandatory nutrition course now. I'm a faculty leader in that course, and I have a talk I got to give pretty soon. I'm changing it out. Last year, I think I focused on, ketones in the brain. And this year it's going to be on cancer, I think, but maybe start with the brain a little bit. But yeah, it starts, we need to, so my big mission, I've sort of transitioned, not totally, but more towards like really impacting medical education and just education in general, I think is a big thrust. And that's through the Metabolic Health Summit, the ACCME accredited platform, I think would be, we need to train physicians about ketogenic therapies, about exogenous ketones, but also the opportunity, and it is a great opportunity to be able to talk to medical students. And I mentor quite a few of them too on projects related to metabolic therapies or ketogenic therapies. And we're looking at, a range of different things. But I think it's important for them to understand that if we want to prevent disease, we need to really focus on metabolic health as the cornerstone for disease prevention, and not just, disease management after it happens, not sick care. So we need to focus on prevention. And I think the newer, like the crop of medical students really understand that. And I think they've even pushed maybe the administration that they're like, nutrition is something that we need to know. I mean, because 70 to 80% of what we see is diet related: obesity, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, kidney problems. A lot of people are on kidney transplants, pretty much the majority of them because of diabetes, right? So I think that the medical students know this, and they need to, and they're just really hungry, no pun intended, for the best nutritional information, because there's a lot of noise out there. And ketogenic diets have been silenced, even in the world of the American Diabetes Association. But now their American Diabetes Association is even warming up to the idea of carbohydrate restriction and even ketogenic diets for type 1 diabetes management, because you're using, less insulin and better glycemic control from that context.
Well, I'll tell you, you're speaking right into my soul. That one of the can you recall the first year you did the Metabolic Health Summit? When was that? USF? Was that 17 or 18?
We did like an earlier meeting. It was more focused on epilepsy, and I think we had like Eric Kossoff and some maybe in 2013 or 14, and then it's like, oh, this was fun. Then it was the Metabolic Therapeutics Conference, I think in 2015 or 16, I think. Yeah, because I remember I didn't have tenure yet, or I was going up for tenure or something like that. So it was right around that time. And then, we hold it as much as we can. I don't know. We've had some gap years here and there because of COVID and
welcome to life. Well, I'll tell you what you do with that conference. So here I was in the Midwest. I'd heard that conversation between you and Tim. I learned everything I could, and every one of my colleagues that I was trying to collaborate with or kind of go to the people who I had learned from before, they knew nothing. They're like, sounds like snake oil. I don't know what you're talking about. And as I backed away saying, all right, that's not the place to learn, you had that summit. And I remember bringing my husband, who's not a clinician, but does love me. And I said, all right, husband, you go down that hallway and take notes from those lectures. I'm going down this hallway, and we're going to compare notes at the end of the day. And he as lovingly as it could be, did that. And this began to feed what I think was missing. And your leadership has been amazing to fill the space that we don't have all the answers, but if we stop questioning and collaborating, we're missing out on a major life-changing therapeutics for the patients. This past year, I took the University of Tampa students that weren't in medicine, but had either some sports or brain interest. And as they went to that conference, all of them changed the way they think and talk and behave with nutrition because of it. And I think even though many of the lectures were well beyond their comprehension for the terms they were using and such, what they saw was, advancements in this are leading to such remarkable reversal of disease that you can't miss that in that conference and when you really get into this space.
Yeah, we had about a half dozen medical students as volunteers for that, or maybe more. It might have been like 10. And that's a great opportunity too to give them exposure, and they see the excitement. They see not only the basic science and the clinicians talking, but we also have patients come up that tell their stories. And then it becomes more tangible to them, like the idea of nutrition as medicine and ketogenic therapies as medicine. So we try to instill that with them, and hopefully they pursue a career where they're implementing this stuff and they prioritize it as a central tenet in their, and what they're telling their patients.
Well, one of the things I was really, you've satisfied already is the voice behind that. I often stand alone on the side of other clinicians who say, you should be in a ketogenic state because of the diet you're on or the exercise you're on. And I often say, yes, that's ideal. But welcome to my clinic where they're 300 pounds. They cannot exercise that way, or they've been so insulin resistant that when they screw up, they don't see a ketone for 6 or 7 days, unlike other people who could see a ketone quickly. And to bridge that, we use exogenous ketones. So I find myself defending them in places where I don't even mean to be defensive, but it really is in this name of, it's not perfect, but boy, it's really important in this clinical application. So my question is, do you have any place where you say they're abused, that they are used in a place that they shouldn't be?
Exogenous ketones?
Yeah.
I'd have to think. No, but I think, so what ticks me off sometimes is that you can't replace a healthy diet. So the ketones are just that, like they are a supplement. And I think the real world kind of benefit is that when you're in ketosis, exogenous or endogenous or exogenous, it has an appetite suppressing effect. It also impacts brain energy and metabolism to kind of tell your brain, like if your brain is getting enough energy, it's not going to signal an energetic crisis. So for example, like if you become hypoglycemic when you're dieting in a calorie restriction, you will have a sympathetic response. Your cortisol will get elevated, and it will basically make you want to eat. It can trigger cravings. But if your ketones are elevated and sustained, your brain will be happy. These are like the early George Cahill studies with Oliver Owen, where they inject insulin and then the subjects were asymptomatic, even with like super low glucose. So the same thing happens in like a calorie deficit situation, that if your ketones are elevated, then your brain's not going to have an energetic crisis. It's not going to trigger that. So like, establish ketosis, high protein. A lot of people will get cravings for things that are sweet, and the fructose epimer D-allulose is a good. Some people may have some GI issues with it, like on an empty stomach, and I did too. But now I can get like 60 to 80 grams of allulose a day, and if I wear a continuous glucose monitor, it goes down. Stays down, and has remarkable effects. So if there's, there you go, yeah. So actually, like one of the projects that we're doing now is doing like a systematic review on all the natural sweeteners, that could be stevia, monk fruit, allulose, erythritol, and kind of like going into the literature on that, on how these are impacting cardiometabolic biomarkers like glycemia, hemoglobin A1C, things like that. So no one's really done it to like a large extent, the natural ones. There's a lot of information on some of the artificial sweeteners. But I think, so that's a tool too. So you have high protein ketosis, and you have natural sweeteners that could be incorporated in small amounts. I'm not a big fan of hyper sweet things, but like, lightly sweetened things so people don't feel deprived. And these are all tools, as you probably implement these things that are really helpful for transitioning that patient. And helping them to sustain what really needs to be some level of calorie deficit over a protracted period of time. And, you might want to pull out tools like GLP-1 agonists and things like that, but largely, patients will ultimately want to come off of them, and there's really no off-ramp. The off-ramp coming off of that, I think, is ketosis, right? So I think all the patients that are jumping on GLP-1 drugs which are not following a ketogenic diet, I think ketogenic protocols and exogenous ketones would be that off-ramp to help them. So high protein exogenous ketones, allulose, especially allulose actually stimulates, is a GLP-1 secretagogue. So there was a Nature Medicine paper. Someone like me would have to take 30 grams in a bolus, but that's 500% increase in GLP-1. So there's these tools that are available that a lot of doctors don't know about that, where you could develop a comprehensive off-ramp protocol for people, that are on GLP-1 drugs, and they work great, right? But they got to come off of them, and their insurance often doesn't cover them over long periods of time.
Well, it is impressive to watch the number of people that have, said, yes, the reversal of my problems when I lost the weight on an Ozempic type medication. I mean, it's undeniable. They're healthier because of the weight loss, but then it's the life afterwards that I think, okay, great. You got to reset in life. Now, let me teach you and this is where I really think that ketogenic space, that education on how do you, find a friend, because this is going to be hard to change something you've been doing for life. We shut it off dramatically with Ozempic or those injections. Yep. And now when you turn that back on, you're going to remember those things that had been rooted in your behavior from your family of origin, probably. And I don't think it's a small task to ask people to do that, but and I'm thankful they have the reversal of their health problems, because it was sending them to either a life without quality or a grave too soon, right? So and I was happy to hear you mention that. Yeah, when you add allulose, you even do stimulate that. I forgot that it was 30 grams for a man your size?
Me, if you're 100 kilograms, I think it was something like 0.3 grams per kilogram or something like that, around that level you would need to mimic the rodent studies from the human, dosing equivalent. So I did a deep dive on the paper and read all the associated, literature on it, because allulose is kind of near and dear to my heart. I think we're doing some research with cancer on allulose. It's a little bit too early to talk about, but as an epimer of fructose, allulose uses the GLUT5 transporter. So in theory, if cancer cells that grow off fructose, like, certain colon cancer cells or lung cancer cells, if they use the GLUT5 transporter to suck up fructose and grow like crazy, and you give allulose, which they can't metabolize, but could also block the GLUT5, then you have the potential for a natural sugar that could further enhance the anti-cancer effects of a ketogenic diet and make it palatable at the same time, right? So we're interested in sort of creating these engineered designer diets that could enhance palatability, enhance therapeutic function with functional components, and that could be, enhancing, putting a prebiotic and a probiotic to enhance the microbiome too, and optimizing the protein and the types of fats. A lot of ketogenic clinicians, like in the epilepsy world, they just kind of, in their early studies use Crisco, right? And then it was hydrogenated. And then they still worked, but I think you have the potential to really titrate and add functional fats like, DHA, EPA, MCT, and there's a whole range of different types of functional fats that you could incorporate into even a whole food ketogenic diet or a ketogenic meal bar or shake or something like that. Like, I just have so many ideas for things. I have notebooks and notebooks of ideas, and I just have to create the time to, yeah, we're pretty busy in the lab. And I think our kind of motto is moving the science to clinical application. So
Well,
I tinkered around a lot in cell studies for a long time and then moved it to animals. And now we're doing some human studies. So
your work impacts a lot of people. I actually think back to one of the conversations you sparked in my own medical school when I was in South Dakota with Bill Harris, who now is in collaborating with Pat. Rhonda Patrick.
Oh, Rhonda Patrick.
Rhonda Patrick, yeah. On the
Oh,
Omega,
yeah, yeah. Right.
right,
Yeah,
Omega-3 science. And,
Yep.
I
Omega
wanted
Quant.
him,
Yep.
Omega Quant, exactly. So yeah, he was a couple seats down from me as faculty on our medical school world. And he was such a quiet, humble man. I had no idea he did all the things he did. And he sat 2 chairs away from me. I'm like, you are the guy from all these studies? Anyway, but that Crisco, where you say it did work, I so did not want that to be the answer. I wanted all of those awful oils to just be toxic and terrible. And I could never get Bill Harris to say these, like, the studies do not support what you're saying. I know you want the answer to be that way. And I really think that's why the commitment to say, folks like you, where you're saying, I can see without a doubt that here's something that I do here in Tampa is that right outside my window here is the Pin Chasers, which is the bowling alley here in Tampa, right? And every Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, I hold a free support group for anybody who wants to come ask a physician about a ketogenic diet or look for a support group of other people trying to change this behavior. And that rooted from my years in clinical practice in South Dakota, where when you try to get somebody to stop drinking booze or stop sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever it is that they are habiting in the wrong direction for, don't do it alone. You need a friend. And I'll tell you that the space of rescuing somebody from some of those behaviors has a lot of the same rules, but it is not without some of the supplements like exogenous ketones, where I can say, I know that it's going to take you another 2 weeks to get back to the therapeutic level because you are still 180 pounds overweight. But it is some of those tips and tricks that you've taught through your clinical practice that allow them the freedom. So I'm going to say officially, thank you for that. Give me a couple of insider ideas of, is there going to be a metabolic summit this next year in 2025? And if so, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we have a planning meeting and we'll probably take a gap year just because it takes so much time, effort, and funding. It's like, it's expensive. You make money off running these things, that's for sure. It kind of puts you in the hole. But yeah, we're really putting a lot of time and effort to develop the online platform, which is ACC accredited. So the people who run that is my co-host, my near and dear to my heart, Victoria Field and Dr. Angela Poff. So they are kind of run that show. I kind of come in to support it, when I can. And we have the Metabolic Link podcast where we have a whole bunch of people lined up. We've already banked so many podcasts. So we're creating content that we hope will help the practitioners understand kind of the science behind this, and then really the clinical applications and the implementation part is also like really important. So we're working on that, and yeah, just like plugging away in the lab.
What I use for my CME is those lectures because it's fantastic. And it's the stuff I'm curious. I mean, on the edge of this science, there still is this, this paucity of people who can offer the advanced education when you say, fill in the blank. I don't have the answer for patients at this level. And, you don't always get all the answers, but there's a lot better understanding after those conferences for sure. So, yeah,
I mean, it's like an affordable way to get the most cutting edge information from the top, thinkers in the space. So I'm just grateful I have access to them and that they agree to talk in our Metabolic Health Summit and also the Metabolic Link podcast. And yeah, we're just trying to move the bar forward and trying to do it in ways that, people can access to and have access to that. So not everybody can come to the Metabolic Health Summit. We realize that. So we realize that, going in the direction of online education is super important too. But yeah, we definitely want to hold another one. We just haven't gotten nailed down the exact time and location.
Take your time. Don't burn out. We're all here. We'll be there when it's scheduled. Well, so the way I like to wrap up some of these, especially with folks that are so iconic in the space, people copy your behaviors. In fact, one of the first people that I ever heard say out loud that they also ate sardines out of a can was you. So you now actually have a place where you raise cows and you have access to grass-fed beef that you know is grass-fed because you do it yourself. But why don't you give the audience an insight into what's a typical day look like for the eating and exercise that you do in your life?
Well, every day is quite different, and I think that's like important too. But it starts out like, it can vary, but I could be teaching. I usually have to either meet with my students. I could be master's, PhD, or medical students and get caught up on all their projects and see how they're doing. Being part of academia, you have like a lot of paperwork and, teaching paperwork. And then there's research in the lab and trying to be as much part of that as possible. So holding lab meetings where we can discuss the results and the implications. And we work a lot on publishing our results. So a tedious component to being a researcher is writing up the publications and getting them submitted and through the review process. So that takes up a lot of time. After a day of doing that, in the office or sometimes working at home, I feel like a caged animal. So many times I usually try to work out like with weights 3 times a week and try to do that like before dinner. And then after dinner, we always take our dogs for a long walk on the farm. And then I kind of follow up with, the cows, and then I give them a little treat at the end of the day that ensures they stay on our property and they don't try to jump the fence and get over into other properties. So, I think we have a really good balance of, being in the lab, working all day, on a device or computers, to just being out in nature, I think is really important. And to have that creative downtime too, I think is really important the farther you get along in your career, because you could just, if my wife wasn't there, I would just kill myself working myself to death because I love my work so much. But she reminds me that, to take a break and get out in nature. So super important. I think that's maybe a take home message. Just create a non-negotiable creative downtime every day where you just get out in nature and be with your loved ones and enjoy the experience living in the moment, I think.
Well, that is a perfect way to end that. So I will use that advice and say, husband, see, I'm not the only one who would work myself to death if it wasn't for you. Well, Dom, I want to thank you for the absolute input that you give to the space and to my channel today. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.